So Matt, I guess first question off the bat is how difficult is salary cap management in the modern era of rugby league?
It's not easy. It's not difficult when you're working collaboratively, in my opinion. We've got a group here that looks at it every day of the week, and it is an every day of the week job. We've got a retention committee that we've put together at present, which involves the chairman, deputy chairman, the CEO, the CFO, the head coach, myself, recruitment manager, a couple of other key personnel on staff. So when you're actually making those decisions and you're getting a wide and varied range of input into it, it does make it a lot easier. The mechanics of managing it in the background, as you alluded to, can get difficult at times. And where they can get difficult is you're really trying to forecast where players are going to sit in years down the track. And if you look at young Brian To'o at the moment, he came in to first grade in 2019, had a way over season, and he's a good example of we didn't expect him to play that many games in that season, and therefore his salary cap value changed. So then we need to reforecast sort of his progression going forward.
In that process, I guess, especially at a development club like Panthers, how early are you starting to earmark players and plan for their progression?
So we've got a system in place. I work closely with Ben Harden and Sam Jones and Jim Jones in the development and recruitment space. We've got a system in place where we start to track players at 15. So we've got a large whiteboard where once we start to identify players into our Andrew Johns Cup team at 15, we start to that's our contracting, first year of contracting. So we don't have any player at the club that's contracted under the age of 15. And when I say contracted, very, very small amounts. And there would only be maybe half a dozen players at that age. But from that age, we've got a large series of whiteboards where we start to track those players based on their contract terms. So if they're contracted for multiple years, on that board, when you look at it, you'd be able to see every contracted player in the club for season 2020, season 2021, season 2022, from under 15s all the way through to first grade. It exists on 2 whiteboards at the moment, but we can track them right through the system. So, and then we've also got capacity then to, he might be a developing player. He might go up onto that whiteboard on a magnet in a different colour. So although he's not currently contracted, we sort of forecast that he's one that's going to come through in the next couple of years.
Does the system, as it stands, I guess, give us any advantage or benefit from being a development club and having these players, in the Panthers system from 15, 16 years old?
Yes and no. The benefit is being a development club, we actually start to engage with the players at a younger age group. So, our first engagement point in the club at the moment is we run an under 13s Cubs program. So at 13 years of age, there might be 550 kids registered in that age group, and we've got 100 that come in and do a little development program before Christmas. So our touch point is very early within the club, which actually gives us the opportunity to identify future talent and work with it. Now, the fact that we're a development club and we've got these large development programs, it allows us to identify it probably earlier. We've got a large district, so we're farming the farm, as we say in here, from a development point of view. The challenge is, because we've got a lot of very good young juniors that come through our system, is identifying the ones that we desperately need to secure, and identifying the ones that if another club was to come and put pressure on us, that we could lose, and then ensuring that the ones that we want to keep, when other clubs come in and try and secure their services, that we're in a position to get it done before anyone else. And that's a very difficult thing for us as a big development club.
How frustrating is, I know we hear from the fans a lot, we're just the breeding ground for other clubs to come in and pluck, our talent. Is that a frustration?
For sure. And as I said, we spend a lot of money on development. The amount of young players that come through our system. So we had 9 juniors debut last year, 9 players debut into the NRL system last year that had come through the lower grades. And the reality is, every one of those 9 players, there would be other clubs out there looking at those players saying, well, do we invest in development in our own area, or do we let someone else do it and we cherry pick out at the top? And really the NRL model, there are development-based clubs at one end of the spectrum, and there are recruitment-based clubs at the other end of the spectrum. And whether one's right or whether one's wrong, it's just differing business models between the NRL. The reality is probably ourselves and the Roosters are at the opposite ends of that spectrum. And if you look back historically, if you use Nathan Cleary's age group, the Roosters played Penrith in the SG Ball Grand Final one year, the Roosters played Penrith in an NYC Grand Final one year. So one model is not necessarily better than the other, and that actually highlights it that, you know, that a more recruitment-based model actually works for some NRL clubs. You know, the concern for us is if a club like Penrith stopped developing players, then what would the competition look like in 10 years' time? You know, if clubs like us and like the Parramatters and the Dogs with big development districts and western suburbs and places like that, if we stop putting money in development, because we're not only developing players for the Penrith Panthers, but, you know, as you alluded to, we're also developing players for other clubs. So if development clubs stop developing, you know, our concern is what the competition would look like in the future.
A question that comes up a lot, and I don't know if there's a simple answer, is some clubs, when you look at their rosters, they've got a fully representative roster and they're under the salary cap. And then you look at a club like Penrith at the moment, and we've got a very young and developing team with a few representative players scattered through. How are we basically on the same playing field as a club with a fully representative roster?
Yeah, that's always the question that comes up. You know, it's you know, you see a team play and someone says, well, how did they sign that player? You know, with what they've already got. And the reality is, you know, the perception of player value or what players signed for is vastly can be vastly overinflated in media circles. You know, I'm sure if you pulled salary caps out of every NRL club, you would look down the list and you would say, I thought that player was on way more money than that, and there would be players there that you would think, or, you know, he's on the opposite. But at the end of the day, we're all working off roughly a $9.5 million salary cap. A club like us, you know, part of spending money in development is when those younger players come through our program, we would like to think that they want it, like they may be able to secure slightly more money in a deal somewhere else. But, you know, they've grown up in Penrith, they've grown up with these same players. You know, some of our boys have played Harold Matthews together all the way through to first grade at the moment. So, not that we exploit it, but you'd like to think that, you know, players would be prepared to actually stay in Sydney for probably less money than they may actually get on the open market somewhere else.
This off-season, we've seen a fair bit of movement, especially with some big name players. One that's, you know, currently in the headlines is Latrell Mitchell. Our fans' response sometimes when those players become available is, they're a good player. Why isn't Panthers jumping in and trying to pick them up? They would make us a better team. What's the response to that?
So just to give you a bit of background on how the salary cap works. So all clubs have to have 26 contracted players on their books by November of the new football year. All clubs then have to have 29 players on their books by 1 March of that year. And then all clubs have to have 30 players, 30 registered contracts by June that year. Panthers, as we sit today in December, we're currently holding 29 contracts in the first grade squad, with X amount of dollars left in the salary cap. So when we talk about the Latrell Mitchells of the world, you sort of think you have to look at it in two different columns, I suppose. Do you have list space, which we do? Do you have cap space, which we don't? So when a particular high-profile player comes onto the market, it's very easy to say, well, you could fit him into your list, but you can't necessarily fit him into the cap. The other part of that is you may have cap space for the current season, but when you talk about a representative style player like Latrell, do you have the same amount of cap space for future seasons? And taking up that cap space for future seasons then puts greater impact on getting all the other deals that you're trying to get done in future years, which is where some clubs can really get themselves into trouble.
We often hear about players getting shopped around in the media, and often Penrith is linked to them, particularly when you have a spare spot on your roster. Without mentioning any names, how often do you kind of receive phone calls of players being offered?
Weekly. And that's our salary cap at the moment is vastly different to the NFL model, where it's, you know, there is only it's a different way of guaranteeing money, because a lot of the NFL contracts aren't necessarily guaranteed. You know, we've all seen the movie Moneyball, where it's pack your bags, you're off to, you know, Minnesota type of thing. You know, our contracts are guaranteed, but the reality is, as I said, when when you've got contract value sitting in future years, and then you've got, at the other end of the spectrum, you've got young developing players that are coming off contract and maybe exceed your original value point, and then in order to get them done, you need to sort of increase their contract value. It starts to put pressure on, and the reality is we all need to conform to the salary cap. We're continually developing good players that appeal to other clubs. So probably on a weekly basis, there are clubs ringing, and not just ringing Penrith, but there are clubs ringing every club. Every club would be in exactly the same situation. Just trying to subtly move the pieces around the chessboard to ensure that they're cap compliant.
Something that's been reported a fair bit is how much Penrith is supposedly chipping in for former players who've broken contract early to go elsewhere. You've told me previously that it's quite commonplace, and in fact, when a player leaves early, that's par for the course.
Yep. So, and just in respect to that, the players that has affected in the 2019 season, the other thing I'd love the fans to know is every one of those transactions that occurred was initiated by outside of this club. None of those transactions were initiated by Panthers. And that's the reality of it, that as we spoke about before, we get clubs ringing and saying, we've got a hole here, we've looked at your list and you've got excess there, would you be interested in? And the reality in the business is that when those transactions happen, not always, not 100% of the time, but usually when that transaction happens, that there is a onus on the club that the player's coming from to help make that transaction function smoothly. So,
when those offers come in or there's potential moves underway, in practical terms, how does it work here in terms of the retention and recruitment committee, coming to a consensus?
Yeah, so we don't meet on a set day in the fortnight, but we probably meet fortnightly, and it varies at different times of the year. Obviously, around the June 30, there's a bit of player movement, so we probably meet more regularly. But we've got a set agenda, a rolling agenda, where we talk about what's our current salary cap position. So and the cap changes weekly. Some players have match payments in their contracts. So if he plays first grade on the weekend, the match payments gets calculated and it adjusts the cap. It might only adjust the cap by $3,000, but you do that by 4 players 10 times a year. All of a sudden, it's a sizable amount. So usually, we talk about where our cap position is currently, and then that discussion then goes into player movements. Whether they're players that have been identified externally by us that we're targeting, whether they're players, as we spoke about, that managers have come to us and said, oh look, so-and-so's unhappy here, or so-and-so, or this club's under cap pressure, they're looking at trying to squeeze this player out, would you be interested? So, and the best thing I think about what we're doing at the moment, as I said, we're all talking about it, because it's one thing for the coach to have an opinion on a player. My job is to ensure that if we go down that path, that I'm future-proofing the organisation in future years, that it fits down the track, because the coach's job is not only to, worry about list management, but he's also trying to win games on a week-to-week basis. So he's focusing on that while I spend a lot of time on ensuring that it fits in the future. And the other part is having the CFO in the conversation as well, make sure that the dollars are there and we're compliant. And having Brian in the conversation as CEO obviously gives us a level of compliance with the board in terms of, if we've got to make a financial transaction, which is really good. So,
there's been quite a few players last season who left Panthers who'd been here for a few years or come through the system. Are we now in a position where everyone's comfortable with our roster, with our salary cap, and with, I guess, our future proofing for those young guys that we saw come through last year?
Yeah, I think so. As we've spoken about, the reality is will we be able to keep all of them? We'll try to. Will other clubs probably offer them more money than we can afford at times? Definitely. But we've done a lot of work this year in the last sort of 6 or 7 months to get us to a point where, meeting cap compliance for the 2020 season, which is paramount. But also, getting our list to a point, and there's obviously, we talked about we talk about the salary cap. The salary cap's the top 30 players, but there's actually another salary cap that sits underneath that from a development list point of view, and then a third one that sits under that from a New South Wales Rugby League compliance point of view. So when you've actually got all three working together, you're securing what you need to get done at the top, but you're also ensuring that the layers underneath are feeding the top. We've got a couple of players that will come off contract this year. We'll have to make some decisions on what we're doing with those going forward. But again, part of my role in the development team is when we talk about future-proofing the organisation, that if one rolls out in this position, that we've got, 2 or 3 ready to go behind them. And the reality is one will go in and one will get disappointed because he thinks that should be him, and he may receive an offer to be able to play in the top 30 somewhere else, and then we need to make that decision whether we're prepared to either let him go if he's still contracted or not renew the contract if he's coming off.
In recent times, fans, the media have been quite frustrated, suggesting that contracts in the NRL aren't worth the paper they're written on anymore. What's your kind of take on that?
Football is an emotional business, so I can see at times where people get heavily invested in that side of it. The reality is, it is a multi-million-dollar business now. We would like to think that a contract is a contract, but with the level of compliance that clubs need to work under, the reality sometimes is those contracts get broken to either secure better opportunities elsewhere, and it's a two-way street. Don't forget, there's a contract between, there's an understanding between the player and the club, but there's also an understanding in the opposite direction as well. So yeah, it's becoming not more difficult, but it's obviously becoming more topical because it's happened more frequently, especially in the last 12 months. But I think it's the reality of the business, and I would like to think, from Panthers' point of view, that we've got to a point now where we're comfortable with where we are from a list point of view. I don't think, in the short term, we're going to see ourselves in situations where players are going to be knocking on the door saying, that they're unhappy here and they want to seek opportunities elsewhere, and vice versa. We wouldn't be putting the effort that we're putting into our list manager at the moment to turn around and be tapping players on the shoulders and saying, But as I said, it's a results-based business, and there's expectation on both parties that we're working hard for the players, serving their needs, and they're giving us the very best they can give us every weekend, and 365 days a year around the facility.